So it's a familiar combination of sex, religion, and freedom of speech. So that brings us to Leah. I understand that some recent lawsuits are ultimately aimed at getting a favorable ruling on the Comstock Act from the Supreme Court. So as a constitutional scholar, I was wondering if you could talk about how the Comstock Act is being invoked today and the constitutional questions that it raises.
Yeah, so maybe I could just say a little bit more about the Comstock Act itself, and that will tee up how it could potentially be revived today. So it was originally passed in 1873 as this anti-vice law, and it actually had its origins in Anthony Comstock and others' frustration that they couldn't censor the women who were criticizing and mocking them. That is, they didn't have a law that could actually be used to police these women and other people who were just radically mocking the efforts to suppress sexuality, sex education, and more. And so it was partially based on that agitation that Comstock secures the passage of the Comstock Act. And so what ended up happening, of course, is that after 1873, the Supreme Court during the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s gradually recognizes a broader set of constitutional rights that limits the application of the Comstock Act. In particular, when the court decides Griswold versus Connecticut, when it struck down a state law restricting contraception, that meant the Comstock Act could not constitutionally be applied to limit the distribution of contraception. Similarly, when the Supreme Court decided Roe versus Wade and concluded that abortion was a constitutionally protected right, that meant the Comstock Act could not be constitutionally applied to restrict the distribution of materials used to perform abortions. So then fast forward to Dobbs, when the Supreme Court overrules Roe versus Wade. At that moment, the thinking is, well, it's no longer unconstitutional to enforce the Comstock Act in order to restrict the distribution of material used for abortion. So maybe we can just revive this zombie law that has laid dormant for the better part of 5 decades because it's no longer constitutionally prohibited in its enforcement, at least in cases with respect to abortion. So this was one of the aims of Project 2025. They called on the next Republican administration to revive and enforce the Comstock Act in cases involving abortion. You know, they called for the prosecution of the distributors and producers of medication abortion, as well as doctors who used implements to perform, surgical abortions. And even before Project 2025, there was a lawsuit that was started by this organization, the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is in my view, kind of a Christian nationalist advocacy group. And they filed this litigation against the Biden administration, arguing that the administration's regulations on mifepristone, one of the 2 components of the medication abortion protocol, were unlawful. And one of the reasons why they argued that the administration's permissive regulation of mifepristone was unlawful is because they said the Comstock Act, this federal law, actually makes it a federal crime to distribute medication abortion. And therefore, the FDA couldn't authorize doctors and distributors and other entities to actually mail medication abortion and distribute it. So that lawsuit was filed in the Northern District of Texas, and it was filed there to ensure the case was heard by a very particular judge, Matthew Kacsmaryk, one of the more ideological right-wing appointees of the first Trump administration who has done work with groups like ADF in furtherance of kind of a Christian nationalist agenda. So what does he do when he gets this case? He announces that he is going to require the FDA to effectively ban and stop distributing medication abortion. And one of the reasons he says he's doing so is because distributing medication abortion violates the Comstock Act. So this is a judicial ruling that, again, would bless the Comstock Act being used to prosecute individuals who perform abortions, who distribute devices or medication used in abortions or otherwise. That case went up to the Fifth Circuit. One judge on that 3-judge panel also embraced the idea that the Comstock Act could be used to prosecute distributors and doctors who perform or provide abortion. It goes up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court concludes that the group of individuals who filed the lawsuit, some anti-abortion doctors and dentists, they did not have what's called standing in order to bring the case. In federal court, you have to show that whatever it is you're challenging has a chance of injuring you. And the Supreme Court said, look, you doctors just haven't shown that the availability of medication abortion that other doctors might prescribe to patients somehow injures you because you don't prescribe medication abortion. You're not going to be called on to treat people, who might have complications due to medication abortion, etc. So that temporarily kind of punted this issue of whether the Comstock Act could be used to prosecute the distributors of abortion devices or medication abortion. So right now, pending in the lower courts is another effort to challenge the FDA's approval of mifepristone and medication abortion. This is actually the same lawsuit, but this time it's a group of Republican-led states who are attempting to prosecute and litigate it. So they too are seeking some sort of judicial ruling that would declare that the Comstock Act effectively prohibits on a nationwide basis abortion. Again, if they are successful, this effectively makes the distribution of medication abortion or devices used in surgical or procedural abortions a federal crime. And once you have that ruling, you don't actually need Congress to pass an abortion ban, and you don't really even need the Department of Justice to launch a criminal prosecution of an individual or entity. It's just the threat of that criminal liability that could be sufficient to shut down abortion on a nationwide basis. And this is to say nothing of the free speech implications of the Comstock Act, because in fact the most common usage of the Comstock Act was actually to go after people who talked about abortion, who talked about sex education, and who talked about contraception. And as we are living through this age of a constant unfurling of more and more threats to free speech, I think it would be unwise to dismiss the possibility that the Comstock Act could be revived for those set of cases as well.
So now we'll return to this theme of historical comparison. Project 2025 is Project 1873, and Andy will play another clip, and then I'll ask Leah to compare the past and the present, and to sort of address the question of how current efforts to restrict bodily autonomy and free speech are like or unlike the late 19th century.
The reader of impure literature turns to these implements, or the abortionist, in order to conceal the dire consequences of the crimes he commits. These are articles of diabolical design, cunningly contrived to minister to the most degrading of appetites. And who suffers most from their use? Why, women, of course. Almighty God, in his wisdom, has set certain natural boundaries and ingeniously designed women for their sacred function as mothers. Once you let loose the passions and break down the fear of conception, women will be defenseless to the bestial appetites of men, and the family will be destroyed.
Like most men, Comstock had no understanding of the suffering women endure, especially poor women. But I got to see it up close when I worked as a midwife on the Lower East Side. Typically, the women already had many more children than the family could support. Half died in infancy, the rest were sick and undernourished. And during the excruciating pain of labor, the women would often curse both God and man, especially their husbands. "Take him away," they'd say. "Don't let that brute come near me. I'll kill him." I hated those men for inflicting such cruelty on their wives. But I hated myself even more because I didn't know how to help the women prevent conception. I could, of course, induce an abortion, and many of them begged me to do so, but I didn't trust my skill, and I didn't want to jeopardize my own freedom. Oh, it was incredible the methods they tried. Jumping off tables, rolling on the floor, drinking nauseating concoctions, using blunt instruments. I asked some physicians for advice on the matter. One of them said to me, "Well, children are the only joy the poor have. Immigrant women bring it upon themselves because they indulge their appetites too much. When woman uses her brains more, her procreative organs will function less." That's the best he could offer.
So Leah, we'd love to hear your thoughts about comparisons between past and present, especially about free speech and reproductive rights, and in relation to the clip that we just saw.
Yeah, so just a few parallels to share quickly. One is, of course, that the effects of the regime we are currently living in now, like Emma Goldman was pointing out in the clip, the brunt is being borne by women in lower socioeconomic levels. So last term, the Supreme Court decided a case, Planned Parenthood versus Medina, in which it allowed states to boot Planned Parenthood from the Medicaid program. What that means is that Medicaid patients can't be reimbursed for any care that they receive at Planned Parenthoods. The projections from that decision are catastrophic for what it means for the availability of abortion care, reproductive care, and Planned Parenthood, in states that restrict abortion. And what this means is, there have been studies suggesting, I'm going to get the exact numbers wrong, but something like several tens of thousands of additional pregnancies, in Texas, once the state was allowed to just flat out ban abortion. So some number of unintended, childbirths and pregnancies are now being forced to be carried to term. Many times this is happening, again, with women who just don't have the economic resources to obtain abortion care. Just to take another concrete example, in states that restrict abortion, some states also ban hospitals from providing abortion as a form of emergency health care or stabilizing care. And in those states, pregnant patients, some are actually being advised to obtain helicopter insurance. Helicopter insurance, you heard that right, in the event that they need to be airlifted out of their state in order to receive emergency medical care, because that can cost, $100,000 or more dollars. So one is just, who is bearing the brunt of these actions. Second is the extent to which this campaign is really part and parcel with restricting information. We've talked a little bit about how the Comstock Act was used to prosecute individuals who were sharing education about contraception, sex education, reproductive health care, abortion. One of the very first things that the Trump administration did was to shut down the part of the federal government's website that actually provided information for individuals about where they could obtain abortions, even as there was more of a patchwork, on a nationwide scale about where abortion could be obtained. So we saw federal government directive efforts to suppress information about abortion. Similarly, just as part of the impetus for the Comstock Act was individuals making fun of Anthony Comstock and his allies, where have we seen some of the more censorial impulses of the federal government, being exercised against comedians like Jimmy Kimmel or Stephen Colbert, who are mocking, Donald Trump, his political allies, and those within his circle. Another parallel that came to mind is, as Emma Goldman is recounting the theories of the time about, women's reproductive health care and their ability to have independent thoughts, it's difficult not to think of some of the statements that RFK has made about gobbling Tylenol and its apparent correlation with autism, just blaming pregnant women for trying to manage their own pain for, the phenomenon of autism. So those are just some of the parallels that come to mind. Another is the last one I'll note is just this fixation on restricting abortion and other forms of reproductive health care in order to ensure that women stay within their idealized role of wife and mother, and using that as a form of like social control of women. You saw this in some of the, what I call the latent creepiness of the 2024 presidential campaign with Elon Musk and, other President Trump allies basically saying they wanted to impregnate Taylor Swift and other individuals. When they were criticizing Donald Trump or other individuals, again, they view like forcing women into these roles as a way of disciplining them and controlling them and not allowing them to like have opinions and participate in public life. And so I think that impetus is very much present, in the film and in the clips and behind the Comstock Act, and also remains true to this day.
Well, now it's time for me to throw it open to questions. So who has a question in the audience?
Okay, this is my perennial question these days. So can you also give examples of how the Comstock Act and sort of how resistance sort of came to be and what we might look for, or, ways to navigate this that could change outcomes? Because you've painted a really scary picture and yeah, I'm looking for some hope.
Yeah, so part of the resistance to the Comstock Act was coordinated speak-outs, where women would literally travel the country and actually go to where there might be trials under the Comstock Act or state equivalents, and they would go to courthouses and they would insist on being able to give testimony about their experiences, in childbirth or with lack of access to reproductive health care, or they would demonstrate outside of the courtroom. And that was part of a large push for public education that I think, helped liberalize the enforcement of the state and federal law, as well as public sentiment. So, organized public education was one of, I think, the main drivers of pushback against the Comstock Act and successful pushback against the Comstock Act. And so to the extent that there are parallels like that today, that has a kind of proven track record of being an effective method of resistance.
I think also in a number of those court cases, William Sanger, who was Margaret Sanger's husband, who was actually arrested under the Comstock Act because Margaret Sanger wasn't at home, but he basically turned that trial into massive publicity. And they knew they were going to lose, right? But they used the courts and the court filings to get their message out in a way that they couldn't, just through the newspapers. So I think that was really important. And I also think, hopefully, I know it is like a giant bummer to hear about all this stuff, but in the film, I found it really inspiring to think about the way that people like Emma Goldman, and Ida Craddock persisted. And they did make a huge difference. I mean, they didn't live to see the change, but without them, the change would not have happened. So, I don't know. It's not, I guess the last thing I would say is, when the Comstock Act, or enforcement of the Comstock Act was being advocated in Project 2025, the people who put it there were very specific about saying, we don't want Trump to talk about this. And they wouldn't call it the Comstock Act. They'd call it by, whatever it is, 18 USC something, 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 right? Because they didn't want this to be public knowledge. It's been my experience that most people don't know what's going on with the Comstock Act. So I think it's really important to share this information. They're counting on people not knowing what it is until it happens. So.
Yes, Deb.
Thank you for the message of hope, but I would like to go back to the parallels again between then and now, and that is about the role, the maternal role, the mandatory motherhood. And we all know it's different today depending on the color of your skin, how much you're encouraged to reproduce. And I know that in the 19th century, people like Emma Goldman perhaps would not have been considered white. So in all that mess, you know, the poor being consigned to more children than they desired, how did that play out racially compared to now? Is that too complicated?
I mean, it's a complicated question. I can attempt to give some anecdotes that I think shed some light on it. But in a lot of ways, you know, the movement to restrict abortion laws in the United States, you know, were attributable to this movement associated with, I'm going to blank on his first name, but Dr. Moore, and they were also white nationalists. Like they sought to restrict the availability of abortion because increasingly abortion was being used by white women, and they quite explicitly linked, you know, their concern about declining birth rates among, you know, people that they categorized as white with their fears and anxieties about a United States that was more multiracial and that was not a majority white. So the movement to restrict abortion was, you know, back then around the time of the Comstock Act and again early 1900s, the window when, you know, abortion laws were becoming more restrictive was very much rooted in, you know, racism, xenophobia, and notions of like white supremacy. I think you can continue to see that today. You know, when we look at whose pregnancies are being criminalized, it is disproportionately women of color. If you look at, you know, who the, you know, federal government wants to admit as immigrants, you know, they are affirmatively creating preferences for white Afrikaners and white immigrants, and they are attempting to restrict, you know, migration and immigration from non-white immigrants. So I think it's the same anxieties about the prospect of a multiracial United States where white people and white Christians are in the minority that fuels some of the, you know, anti-reproductive healthcare movement today that also drove it in the late 1800s and early 1900s as well.
I think, you know, Theodore Roosevelt, right, was talking about, he didn't originate the term, but he was talking about race suicide. He was talking specifically about the declining birth rate of white people. And so, so as Leah pointed out, there's this whole demographic, racial aspect to it. There's also, this kind of happened increasingly with Comstock. He started to take note more of the people he was arresting and what their ethnicity was. And I think that's because generally the sort of white population had more and more anxiety in the 1880s, the 1890s, as you have these huge waves of immigration. And a piece of this, the fear about sexuality was a fear about foreign sexuality. I mean, you see it a little bit in the belly dance clip, right? But there was sort of this idea that, you know, these people with non-Protestant, non-white values who can't restrain their sexual impulses are increasingly populating the country, and they're going to corrupt, they're going to corrupt our young people. So there was a xenophobia that was directly connected to a certain kind of sexual anxiety as well, I think. Too much garlic and too much belly dancing, and if you mix the two, I mean.
Can you talk a little bit more about the the censorship aspect of the Comstock Act? I mean, obviously, you know, the abortion, obviously they're linked, but in what ways they can be decoupled to have, you know, wider sort of implications, you know?
Jump in on this because it's a big part of the film. So one of the characters one of my favorite characters in the film, who was one of the people who stood up most for Ida Craddock, was a man who had a paper called Lucifer the Light Bearer, and you can see some reprints of that over on the wall. And why am I blanking on his name? That's crazy. Moses Harman. Yes, thank you. And so Moses Harman, in the 1880s, he started publishing articles that were accounts that were sent to his radical newspaper. They were accounts of marital rape. They were doctors who sent in descriptions of testimony that they'd heard from their patients. And this became a huge censorship battle. So he was thrown in jail. He was arrested on the Comstock 5 times. And it was specifically for printing these accounts of marital rape and other kinds of sexual abuse. So it wasn't just, it wasn't just talking about abortion and contraception, but it was anything to do with sexuality and specifically around gender. Because his program, he was an anarchist, and his program was for the abolition of marriage, or specifically the abolition of involvement of church or state in marriage. So this is a huge threat to Comstock and everything he believed in. So, and you can see, if you read some of those articles on the wall, you can see them going after Comstock, like going right for the jugular. So if you said anything about Comstock, if you said anything about sexuality, if you said anything about, specifically about, abuse, rape, those things were also completely taboo.
So you mentioned a little bit about how, like, with Emma Goldman and Ida Craddock, they were pretty different in, like, their personalities. Like you said, Emma Goldman was more of, like, an anarchist, was an atheist, was more radical, compared to Ida Craddock, who was more kind of conservative and a respectable figure. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how this kind of, like, difference between them might have affected, like, their work, and if, like, Ida Craddock was treated differently by, like, this kind of censorship. I know, like, in the clip it said that it showed, like, Emma Goldman was arrested, but I'm wondering if, like, kind of Ida Craddock's, like, adoption of this more respectable image, like, how it shaped her work.
It didn't really help to be respectable, because she was still talking about these issues. I mean, interestingly, Ida Craddock, not unlike quite a few feminists of the period, were not necessarily in favor of abortion. And she also thought that methods of contraception that used barriers, she didn't favor that either, because she had this theory of this kind of electromagnetism that passed back and forth between sexual partners. So that was her attitude. It was not the same as Emma Goldman's. Emma Goldman was in favor of distributing information about contraception. She also had a much more radical political stance than Ida Craddock did. But one of the reasons I thought it was interesting to have them both in the same film is because they were so different and they were allies. I think one of the challenges now is creating a kind of mass movement that can encompass lots of different points of view that are sort of allied in the cause, and not to become fractured by differences. So if you can have Ida Craddock and Emma Goldman in the same movement, it seems to me that's a huge win. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but the gist of it anyway.
Hi. You mentioned very specifically and shared with us Emma Goldman's acknowledgement of Ida Craddock's work. I'm curious, in the other direction, if Craddock didn't comment on Goldman in particular, do you have a sense of how she specifically, what she thought about what you just talked about, that there were people very different who maybe she disagreed with on other issues, working in the same direction? I'm just curious what you saw.
Yeah, so I don't know that she ever met Emma Goldman and how familiar she was with her writing, but they ran in some of the same circles, particularly in these kind of, there was an organization that was formed in 1902. It was called the Free Speech League. And it was, they took Ida Craddock's case as one of their first cases. Emma Goldman also worked with the Free Speech League, and a number of people that they knew in common were very intimately involved. And Ida knew that there was this whole group of radicals who were associated, but it was also, it was liberals, it was followers of Henry George, it was this huge coalition so she probably would have disapproved of a lot of aspects of Emma Goldman's life and lifestyle, but in as much as they were both defenders of free speech and freedom of religion, they were allied. Yeah.
So thank you for coming.
Thank you, Debbie and Leah, for joining me and for this great conversation. And thank you all for coming and for your excellent questions.